1 live.
Well, aloha, everyone.
Hey, aloha.
Aloha.
And why are we saying aloha? Because we're going to talk about Hawaii.
Specifically Oahu, or the island of Oahu.
Yes.
I'd love to talk about Hawaii tonight. I haven't done that in a while.
Yeah.
It's been about a month or two.
Yeah, we could talk about Magnum PI. Or Don Ho. But now we'll talk about the roads instead.
Yeah, that we could do a whole show just on that.
Yeah, tiny bubbles.
Let's see. Well, we'll give people a few minutes to file in here before we get started officially. As usual with our projects on Gribblenation.org, whether that is on the blog or if it's on the podcast or if it's here on YouTube Live, we are broadcasting from an undisclosed location, as someone would like to say. In fact, we have 3 different undisclosed locations tonight because I have 3 people on this show.
Yes.
Separated by an entire continent. 3 members of the Gribblenation.org staff are here tonight for this show. Let's introduce them briefly here. Yours truly is Dan, a.k.a. Roadway Wiz. You know, that asshole who runs the Roadway Wiz YouTube channel and is also a contributor to Gribblenation.org on the blog. You also may be familiar with my work on the Gribblenation Roadcast as well. We also have Tom from Central California, who has been quite prolific in his contributions to the West Coast since joining the blog site himself. And we also have Doug from New York State.
Yep, and I'm not in my usual location in New York State either. I'm in Schoharie County, New York for a change, which is west of Albany. Kind of near Cooperstown, a little bit outside the Catskills.
Yeah, the weather must be nice and crisp up there.
Yeah, I just put some wood in the stove so I can keep warm tonight. I kind of wish I was in Hawaii right now. I wouldn't have to think about that part.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing about Hawaii weather is that it rarely changes all that much. You know,
although I think they get snow up in the mountains on the Big Island.
They do.
They do. But if you're at sea level on one of the main islands, it really doesn't change a whole lot.
Yeah, perfect luau weather.
Yeah.
Which we did, actually. But we'll get to that in a little bit, probably.
All right, so that's our panel for tonight. It's Tom, it's Doug, and it's Dan. And we're going to talk about the freeways and the state highway system of the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Now, this past winter on Gribblenation.org, mainly Tom and myself, we embarked on a mission to document the entire state highway system of Hawaii in blog form. That is what resulted in the creation of the Oahu Highways page on the blog site itself. And I'll skip ahead to this slide to kind of paint the picture for you. So the Oahu Highways page was born out of our desire to chronicle the history of the state highway system on the island. And it was it utilized information that Tom and I gathered on our respective trips. So, I was out there for a few days in 2019, and Tom was out there for a few days in 2021. We put our respective knowledge bases together, and we used a few other sources along the way, and we came up with the blog series that you see today. The Oahu Highways page is public. It's available for your personal consumption at the link listed here. We certainly hope you check it out if you haven't already become familiar with it. Something else that we've done, Tom and I collaborated on a podcast episode. If podcasting is your kind of thing, you might enjoy the episode that I have listed here. That's another really good overview discussion of the island, the history of its state highway and freeway system development, and some other things along the way. The Roadway Wiz channel has also been home to a complete set of footage of the interstate and state highway systems on the island of Oahu. This is again featuring footage that was gathered on the 2019 trip, and that's also available at this link here. And of course, we can't continue without also mentioning HawaiiHighways.com, which is not affiliated with our work. It's a separate website. I believe that's Oscar's site, isn't it?
It's Oscar's site. He was incredibly generous helping out, flesh out some of the histories of some of these highways, or pretty much most of them.
Yeah, so he's got some great information on that site, devoted not just to Oahu, but the entire state of Hawaii, all the islands. So his site was also invaluable to us in our research for the blog series. So that's another site that you should add to your bookmarks and check out when you have the chance. Tom, you were in Hawaii last year.
Correct.
Would you like to give us a brief summary of your trip and like what the scope of it was, and briefly some of the stuff that you saw while you were out there?
So Hawaii was the second to last state that I have not been to. So the only one got left is Alaska. See, me and my wife and a bunch of her family members got together last year because Waikiki, especially, was having a lot of discounted rates because tourism was relatively low, given how difficult it was to get into the state with all the COVID vaccination and kind of like this port of entry type form. So we were only there for 4 days, really got a good rate on sharing everything in a kind of like a timeshare type hotel thing. Did a lot of the typical tourist stuff like around Honolulu, Waikiki, Pearl Harbor. But we did drive around the island one of the days to try to knock out as many of the roads as we possibly could. I got all the major stuff, going through the mountain range in the middle of the island. 163, Interstate H3, 283. The only big miss of my trip was not doing Hawaii 93 all the way to the bend and part of Farrington Highway.
Yeah, which is a really special drive also, and that's one that definitely you should experience the next time you're out on the island. But yeah, I'm glad that you were able to do all the stuff that you were able to accomplish out that way. As for me, my trip out there was in February 2019. I had 5 days on Oahu. I had a single room studio apartment a couple blocks from the beach in Waikiki, and it was just great. The weather was gorgeous the whole time. I was able to not only clinch the interstate system in Hawaii, but also, to the best of my knowledge, not only the signed state highway system on the island, but also quite a bit of the unsigned, 4-digit state highway nonsense on the island. And we'll talk more about that later. But what came out of that trip was the first real full photo and video documentation of one of the Hawaiian Islands. And the YouTube channel that I run was the first home of a complete set of video footage of the interstate system on the island and also the state highway system of the island. So these were very significant breakthroughs in the history of the road enthusiast community, I think. And I think that they have, as time has gone on, they have helped move the needle. We've seen there be more interest in Hawaii across the hobby since that time. So I'm encouraged by that, and I hope that that trend will continue in the years ahead. So that's that. Now, to give you a little bit of an overview of what to expect tonight, we're going to break down this island in what I would call chapters. So we'll go through the interstate system, we'll go through the major state highways, and then we'll have a section devoted at the end to sort of a rapid-fire honorable mention state highway section. We will also have time to talk about the history of the American Armed Forces on the island of Oahu, which of course played a major role in the development of the island's population and also the development of its freeway system after World War II. That deserves a lot of attention as well. So to give you a little bit of an introduction to Hawaii, the Aloha State, statewide the population is about 1.5 million. The city and county of Honolulu, which makes up the island of Oahu, is about 1 million people per the 2020 census. Over the last couple hundred years, Hawaii has gone from being a sovereign Polynesian kingdom to America's 50th state, and a lot has happened along the way between those two periods. Hawaii was admitted to the Union as the 50th state in 1959, the same year that Alaska joined the Union. Honolulu has been described as the world's most remote large-scale population center, and that comes from the fact that it is a large city of the island has a population of 1 million people, but it's the most isolated major population center, which is to say that I think the nearest major population center is 3,000 miles away in California. So, of course, that happens when you're completely surrounded by water for that amount of distance. Its position in the Pacific Ocean is, really helps give rise to the cultural crossroads that you see on the island and in the state in general. You have the native Polynesian influence, you have the American influence, obviously, because of its statehood. Also, you have a lot of Far Eastern influence, like Japanese, Chinese, Philippines, also, perhaps most of all, Korean. There's a lot of Korean influence in Hawaii. So anytime that you walk around the tourist district in Honolulu and Waikiki in that area, you will see a lot of, Korean, Far Eastern influence in the dining and also some of the sightseeing. And of course, the economy of Hawaii has really revolved around national defense. The military has countless different installations on Oahu and the other islands. Agriculture remains a big economic thing for the state. And obviously tourism, it's situated right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's got an ideal climate year-round. And it's a perfect place to go and take a vacation for a couple weeks. Or just, you could do something that a couple of my colleagues did. My professional colleagues did a couple of years ago. You could just move there. And if the 48 states aren't doing it for you, maybe you give Hawaii a try. Armed forces in Hawaii. I know, Tom, this is something that is very central to the development of the state, of the island, and of course the state highway and freeway system as a whole. Would you like to take a stab at some of this?
So, obviously, everyone probably knows about December 7th, 1941, and the attack on Pearl Harbor. But military influence on the island of Oahu, especially, goes back way further. It's kind of part of how the whole statehood thing transition from a kingdom to a state or a territory really began. There's just a huge presence on the island of Oahu, and some of the other islands do have a little bit of military presence, but it's mainly centered around Oahu. And you have every branch of the military there. You got Joint Base, Pearl Harbor, Hickman, which most people are familiar with around the Honolulu area. Marine Corps Base, Hawaii on the windward side of the island. You have the Schofield Barracks, and just a bunch of little tiny ones I can't even recall off the top of my head. But this is really kind of a central reason why there's so much federal money that went into Oahu, is because the infrastructure needed to be developed to transport military equipment, troop movement, and stuff like that. So even before the interstate system, you had a lot of federal aid programs that were going into road development, especially on Oahu.
Yeah, and of course, Hawaii is a central, ideal location to have some sort of major base for American Pacific Fleet operations. And so the U.S. government realized very early on that Hawaii was going to be central to national defense during, obviously, the years of World War II, but also as the Cold War got going. And really in the 50s and 60s, that's when you start to see the explosion of the bases and the infrastructure that we now see today. And that's all born out of the need to always be on guard as the Cold War heated up in the years after World War II. So, state and federal highway system. Now, you will notice that there are no U.S. highways in Hawaii. But there was a brief period of time during the Second World War when the U.S. government issued a temporary federal route system. You can see an example shield that was used here in the lower left corner. Tom, that was something that was used post-Pearl Harbor, I think, and it was discontinued right after the victory over Japan, if I'm not mistaken. It was only maybe in place for a few years, tops, right?
That's really the unclear part. Yeah, you're right. It did kind of come into play after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but I'm not really sure when it was discontinued or if it really went up to the 1955 renumbering of the state highway system. So basically you had single-digit or double-digit U.S. route type shields that were placed on primary highways like Ferryton Highway, Kamehameha Highway, the Pali Highway. And basically how they worked was you had a lot of spur routes that were given a early iteration of this Hawaii spade, which I have never conclusively proven in any documents I've read that is a knockoff of the California spade, but that's what I suspect. But the Hawaii routes were kind of like secondary highways. So usually they had a number that started with the route they connected to. So they're almost like 3-digit spur roads, or would be like an alternate of a U.S. route type shield federal route.
Yeah. So it's the only time that there's been some semblance of a U.S. highway system. I know that there might have been some chatter about assigning a U.S. route to Hawaii post-statehood, but nothing ever really came of that. Plus, I'm not even sure that they would know what they would want to assign it as, like what route number they would assign it as. But, of course, that's a purely hypothetical scenario.
The AASHTO did send them a letter in the 1980s to state Hawaii Department of Transportation, asked them what U.S. routes they wanted to sign, and their response to the letter is basically kind of like, why would we want that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those curious what-if kind of things, yeah. So, as Hawaii stands currently, it's the smallest quantity of state highway mileage of any state in the U.S. And part of that, obviously, is because of the isolation of the state as a whole, and also because of just the fact that there's not a whole lot of land to work with.
Right, it's about the size of Connecticut.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So, between all the islands.
Okay, yeah. So, Yeah, there's not a whole lot going on there as far as, the amount of real estate that you have to build a state highway system on. And that's just, dealing with the land area, and then you get into other factors such as the terrain and other natural obstacles, and it's even more difficult to build highways. Not only is that a major challenge, but also the fact that, this state is so isolated. It's very difficult to coordinate construction. It's very difficult to coordinate supplying construction projects that are just so remote from the rest of the country. And so that created another obstacle and another set of challenges that needed to be overcome, especially when it came time to construct the interstate system that we'll talk about in due course. This was not exactly like building freeways in California. All the stuff in Hawaii had to be planned, especially to a much more stringent degree because of the fact that everything was so isolated and it was so difficult to just to get to Hawaii was a challenge, even back in the 60s. So it was an interesting, engineering and logistics challenge to get the system of Hawaii up to what it is today. And I suppose that gives it a little bit more intrigue than most other states. I have some maps on the screen here. This one on the left, I know it's not really easy to see this, but this is 1946, what they have here. It looks like if you blow this up, you can see some of the federal routes listed on this map on the left. The map on the right is from it's from later than that. I don't remember what the year is on that one. But
9.
Okay, so right around statehood?
Yeah.
Okay.
I also shared a link to the page that we have about the directory of the World War II highway system of Oahu to the live chat.
Okay.
Which actually has a copy of at least one of the maps.
Yeah, the
and,
one.
Some of them are a little more blown up detail too. So.
Yeah, that everything on that page is based off the map on the left, the Army Day map. Basically, you had a Hawaii route to like everything. Like if you had like a radio tower, you had a spur highway going to it. So it's a lot of stuff and hard trying to figure out where some of it is because there's not. Some of them are just basically completely abandoned in modern times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we go to the next slide here, this is maybe a bit easier for you to see. You have the makings of the interstate system starting to take shape here. You can see the 3 mainline interstates, at least dotted lines on the map now. And you also see some other state highways here that have either been renumbered or they just no longer exist, period. Like a couple of the ones that I focus on is Highway 930 around the northwest tip of Oahu. That's no longer drivable, at least not unless you have like a Hummer. And also the combination of Highway 78 and 780 there on the west side of the island, between, say, Waianae and Whitmore Village area, Schofield Barracks. You used to be able to drive east to west across that part of the island, but that highway across the Waianae Range is no longer a public road. I think the Army still utilizes it for exercises and whatnot, but it's not a public highway anymore.
They do, and I've heard that if you have like a CAT card, you can access that road still over Kolikoli Pass, but I'm not certain about that.
Okay. Yeah, so you have 2 major mountain ranges here on Oahu. You have the Waianae Range on the west shore, and then you also have the much larger Koolau Range, which runs from the north side of the island right on down, the spine of the windward side of the island, all the way down to east of Honolulu. And that range really is the defining geological obstacle for the island and how it developed after World War II. Obviously, you weren't going to be able to easily build highways across those mountains, So crossing them became a huge challenge, and so that affected what areas of the island could be developed. It's the areas that were accessible, basically. So that's why the north side of the island doesn't really have a whole lot of development. It's very rural. The south side of the island, where the major population centers are, that was the easiest accessible part of the island. And then also you have the highways going across the island to Kaneohe and the naval base, and the Marine Corps base on the northeast corner of the island there. Made possible by engineering advances, really. That's how that area of the island was able to develop. And here's kind of a look at the island today. You've got, you see the 4 interstate highways here. Those are the highways in orange. And then you have the other state highways that kind of do their own thing. It's important to recognize that on Oahu, for the most part, people don't refer to highways by their state route number. They refer to them by their name. So, for instance, you won't hear people refer to it as Highway 93. In Waianae, you'll hear them refer to it as Farrington Highway. Same thing for Highway 61. It's not Highway 61 to Hawaiians. It's called the Pali Highway. This is also one of those things that it's a bit of a nomenclature thing that you have to get used to when you go out there. Another thing, Tom, that I know you've come across is that, and this is something that I certainly was very familiar with while I was out there, that Hawaii DOT doesn't always do a very good job of signing these state highways anyway.
No.
So learning where the state highways are doesn't always really help you that much. It's generally more helpful just to learn the names of highways.
Correct.
Yeah.
Even then, there's some deviations between modern highways and following the named highway, like around Kananoe. Like if you tried to follow Kamehameha Highway, you would end up on probably the oldest part of it, which is not actually a very great through road, as opposed to following 83. But 83 isn't signed really with any true continuity signage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not even sure that Hawaii DOT knows what these routes are in some cases, but we'll talk about that. If you kind of take the previous slide and blow it up a little bit so that we have a view closer to Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, just the large expanse of real estate that is occupied by the American Armed Forces. You can see, I mean, this is just a sampling of the number of installations that are present on the island. Of course, you have Pearl Harbor here on the upper left for reference, and Honolulu is down at the lower right of this map. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of installations that need advanced connectivity, and so that's what really gave rise to the development of the interstate system. Oh, and one other thing I should mention before we actually move on here. Tom, I know you want to say a word about the blue stop signs. I couldn't really find a good place for them in the slideshow, so I'm putting them here. So if you'd like to comment on those, please.
So, a lot of travelers have noticed when they've gone to Hawaii that there's blue variants of stop signs and sometimes other off-color traffic control signage. And what that is, basically on private drives, the state requires you use a non-official color to make it seem or appear like the traffic device you're using is a non-official, non-DOT approved traffic device. So the one on the right, I found that in like a taco truck alley right in the middle of Waikiki. Just sitting there as like the ice cream edition of the stop sign. So kind of neat to find. There's more of them than just the stop signs, but you really probably kind of got to be a little bit in the traffic control to really notice anything that's kind of off color to anything else in the MUTCD.
Yeah, because other than the color, it looks like a regulation stop sign.
Yeah, there is literally no difference except the color, usually.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very interesting. I found these two on the left during my trip out there, and I guess there's quite a few of them, especially in that Waikiki Diamond Head part of East Honolulu there.
Yeah, there was another one I didn't get a picture of that was right by the tunnel that goes into Diamond Head Crater. That was just kind of sitting there. Looked like the military used quite a bit of them too, but other than private drives.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the military can do whatever the heck they want, right? They are the military.
It's wild. That's we probably dedicate a whole show to lack of MUTCD adherence with the U.S. military. It gets pretty wild.
Oh boy. Oh yeah, I've seen some stuff on West Point that's pretty wild myself. So I hear you. I believe it. Okay. Let's talk interstates. You see the four of them that are signed. They are represented here on this slide. All right, so this is the question that I know we have to answer anyway, but it's a good question to answer right off the bat here. And it's the question that I posed to you at the top of the slide here. And it's one question that you hear time and time again, I would say on a regular basis in the road enthusiast community. People always bring up the idea of why does Hawaii even have interstates? And it has to do with a number of factors. I would say that the easiest answer that I have to give to that, and I know that Tom can expand on this too, is that the interstate system was created, of course, out of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. And what it did was it created a federal program for states to access federal funding to build highways of a certain standard to facilitate, it was the interstate and defense system when it was created, although we don't really use it as such today. It allowed the states to build standard highways for that purpose. And so my answer to that question at the top of the slide is very simple. It's that, well, Hawaii is a state, just like the other 48 states that have signed interstate highways, and Hawaii is entitled to build and develop their own freeway system that would match the interstate system standard. I think a lot of people get caught up on the word interstate, and they take that literally, but the key here is that that's not what the word interstate means. The interstate term really speaks to the connectivity of the system between metropolitan areas across state lines, military installations across state lines, and within state lines. It was intended to be an all-encompassing system that provided the ultimate connectivity between population centers and military installations. And perhaps never more is this evident than on the island of Oahu, where you see these highways developed and built very specifically in the places that they are to facilitate that military and population center connectivity. Pearl Harbor, the Marine Corps base, the Schofield Barracks, just to name a few. You look on a map and you see how convenient it is that these interstates connect directly with those installations, and they also connect with the population centers of Honolulu, Kapolei, and Kaneohe as well. So really, the interstates on Hawaii are no different from the interstates on the mainland. I mean, they still adhere to the regular interstate standard. I think the thing that also needs to be addressed here is the H prefix, which really was done as an administrative thing more than anything else. The Federal Highway Administration did not like the idea of utilizing traditional numberings for the system in Hawaii because they were afraid of creating confusion between these numbers and the numbers that could be used on the mainland. So they decided on the H prefix for these numbers really to separate them and to sort of keep them separate to avoid confusion. That's really where that came from.
And you see that at least on paper for Alaska and Puerto Rico as well, because they also have roads that fall under the interstate system.
Yeah, I mean, the Alaska and Puerto Rico systems are a different animal, but you're right that, there is, the Alaska system is A1 through A4, and then Puerto Rico is, PR1 through PR3, I think?
Something like that, yeah.
But, that's really why they did it. They wanted the contiguous 48 states to have the main numbering convention of 1 through 99, and so to separate out the catalog a little bit, and because also, I mean, realistically, there's no way that Interstate H1 is ever going to go to San Diego, so it's okay to separate and create, a unique numbering convention for the highways on Hawaii. And of course, the other thing that I want to mention is that you look at the map and you say, well, the numbers H1, H2, and H3 are kind of arbitrary. Well, they are on first glance, but actually the numbering makes a lot of sense. The Hawaii DOT, the Federal Highway Administration, created the numbering system that they did in the order in which the freeways were proposed and officially approved and funded. So H1 was the first corridor that was approved by Federal Highway, and that was, for the most part, the first highway that was built. H2 was the second one, and then H3 became the third one. H201 is a different animal altogether that we'll talk about in a little bit. But the three mainline, quote-unquote, routes, H1, H2, and H3, they were numbered in the order in which they were funded. And so that's where those numbers come from. Tom, would you like to add anything, or did I cover that pretty well?
You hit it pretty well. I think the thing that you really need to target, if you're thinking about why Oahu has interstates, is just the massive presence of military installations alone justified its reasoning. You're not going to find a bigger cluster of them anywhere stateside. So when you think of military bases, even on the mainland U.S., usually you have some sort of interstate facility attached to them by proxy, or at least a freeway.
Yeah, I'll give you an example from my travels over this past winter. Was in Texas, they couldn't wait to sign Interstate 14 in Central Texas, which is 25 miles. But it connects I-35 with Fort Hood, which is a major military installation. The proximity of military bases and the density of military real estate on Oahu alone justifies the creation of some sort of connective interstate standard system. I would also like to remind people of the simple statistic that Oahu Island alone is 1 million people. And any other major metro area of 1 million people or more has interstate highways. So I, for one, cannot imagine Hawaii not having a freeway system. Or the island of Oahu, anyway, not having a freeway system. Honolulu absolutely should have one. And as I said, Hawaii is a state just like the other 48 states with signed interstate highways. So absolutely, they are entitled to take advantage of the perks provided in the Federal Aid Highway Act and the Hawaii Statehood Act that followed in 1960. So that answers the why does Hawaii have interstates question. Now, as I said, the designation of Hawaii and interstates is a little unusual, and it has its roots more in administrative logic. But you see how they came up with the shield that they have today. So you have the H prefix. The original shields, of course, had the state name in them. There appeared to be 3 different standards of shields over the years, and I have them from top to bottom here. So, for example, the H1 shield had 3 different iterations, and in fact, you'll still see at least the lower 2 of these on signs every once in a while. The hyphen was the standard originally. The hyphen was no longer made appropriate at some point along the way, although Hawaii DOT has been replacing hyphen shields with new hyphen shields. So somebody at HDOT hasn't exactly gotten the memo yet from what I can tell. And then I was having a little bit of fun with some of these other shields you see here on the right. So, H1A and H101, I mean, that's kind of, if you take the lessons learned from the H1 shield and apply those to some of the other proposed designations on the island over the years, that's kind of what you would come up with. I should mention, I know I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but the H1A shield is completely hypothetical, as is the H101. They were never produced, even though they were proposed for a highway that we'll talk about in a little bit. But you can kind of use a little bit of process of elimination to come up with what the shield might have looked like had it actually been approved. All right, let's go through these. Starting, of course, with H1, which is the major east-west freeway across the southern portion of Oahu. It's divided into two major segments. The section through Honolulu proper is known as the Honolulu Freeway. It's the oldest section of H1. It's also the oldest section. It's the oldest freeway section in Hawaii. It was built. That section was largely built in the 1950s, pre-statehood, and obviously modern interstate highway standard. This is also Hawaii's busiest freeway. At one point near Pearl City, it gets as wide as about 13 lanes, if I'm not mistaken. So it's people like to ask about, well, why does Hawaii have interstates? Well, I would like them to look at that section of the H1 out there by Pearl City, and maybe they can explain to me how Hawaii shouldn't have that freeway.
Yeah. Driving at 7 a.m. It's a nightmare, even with 13 lanes.
Yeah, try clinching H1 at rush hour. Believe me, you're gonna feel like you're in California, I'm sure. The eastern half that runs through Hawaii proper is the Honolulu Freeway. The western section is known as the Queen Liliuokalani Freeway. That is named for the last sovereign monarch of Hawaii prior to the annexation of the kingdom by the United States in the 1890s. HOV lanes, contraflow lanes. The section through downtown Honolulu was widened by a lane in each direction, and they did that by eliminating the shoulders on a good part of that. So now you have 4 and 4 per direction instead of the 3 lanes each direction that you used to have. There's also an HOV lane out west of Honolulu that they use that's reversible, as far as I know. But then again, that's a peak rush hour thing that they do. It runs in the eastbound direction in the morning and the westbound direction in the afternoon. So the first section of H1 to be built was the section through downtown Honolulu. The last section of H1 to be built was out by the airport. The elevated highway that cantilevers over Nimitz Highway there, that was the last section of the interstate to be built, if I'm not mistaken. That was completed in the mid-1980s. You guys can jump in with anything if you want to add anything.
So one that kind of comes to mind for Interstate H1, a lot of it was originally signed as Hawaii Route 72.
And I guess that was before
before the Statehood Act.
Okay, yeah.
Right. It was assigned as part of Hawaii Route 72 during the 1955 Hawaii route renumbering.
Yes. Sounds familiar. Almost like I read it or something.
Yeah.
It's almost like we have blog posts about these roads, right?
Oh yeah, it's so much easier to write stuff to remember. But yes, 1955 when it was assigned that number. So yeah, I don't remember the exact interim alignment through Honolulu, but you had the arterial that went through there that was built like I think it was 1953, 1955 that was incorporated into H1 originally. Then you had Hawaii Route 72 that kind of jogged around Honolulu and went up the corridor of what is now Interstate H201.
Yeah. This is a really enjoyable urban drive. And again, maybe you wouldn't necessarily assume that a freeway in Hawaii would be a great urban drive, but this really was an enjoyable trip. But again, it like any other big city freeway, you got to hit it at the right time of day. Otherwise, it can just be absolutely miserable traffic-wise.
Yeah, and you could see the 45 mile per hour speed limits. You would have a very difficult time achieving that during rush hour. But when it's like free and clear, like on a weekend, it's hard to go below 65 through there.
Yeah, and that speaks to the substandard nature of the original arterial, and
right,
just the design specs that they were working with. It really isn't all that different from freeways that exist in cities like New York or Philadelphia. They were built all with the same basic 1950s era blueprint. Whether they're on the mainland or out in the Pacific Islands somewhere. And here's another view. This is taken from a pedestrian bridge out in East Honolulu. And again, you can kind of see, you see a substandard exit ramp on the right in this picture below. And then again, you don't have much of a shoulder to work with in either direction here. But again, that this is just a reflection of the period of time that this highway was built in. 1950s, post World War II, right around the time when interstate standards were becoming a thing, but not quite just yet. So, you basically shoved these highways in on narrow right of ways wherever you could, and it was probably state of the art by 1950s standard, but it didn't age very well.
No, then there's some strange lane markings too, especially like around the interchange between 201 and H1, where you have like some solid white lines that go for quite a while, where they really don't want you trying to merge in with traffic until like a certain point.
Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah. H2. The three mainline highways, and I say mainline in air quotes, if you had H1 as the main highway, you could argue that H2 and H3 are spurs. And in a normal situation, they would be numbered as spurs off of the mainline highway. But again, because we're dealing with Hawaii and we're dealing with a different circumstance altogether, the 8-mile H2 freeway gets its own mainline route number. This highway runs northward, connecting H1 and Pearl Harbor with Army installations at Schofield Barracks, the Wheeler Army Airfield, and the Whitmore Village. From a civilian point of view, this road is also very useful as a freeway bypass of a sizable segment of Kamehameha Highway through central Oahu. And over the years, as this freeway was built, it gave rise to a lot of suburban development in central Oahu. The H2 freeway was built mainly in the late 60s and early 70s, and it has always been built to the length that it is today. It's about 8 miles altogether, and it's never been proposed to extend further north towards, say, the north shore of the island. It's always been intended to end where it does. I would say that of the 4 Hawaiian interstates, this is the least climactic of the 4, the least interesting of them, but it's also the quieter of the 4, traffic-wise. So it it serves its purpose very well, even today.
Least contentious of them too. I don't think there was like any real pushback I saw in its construction when I was looking into its history.
No, H2, it's a boring drive, and it's also got a boring history, from what I understand.
Very, very straightforward. It was built relatively fast.
Yeah. All right, now here is the moment that you've all been waiting for, and I suppose that we could just spend the next 2 hours talking about H3. There's a lot of different directions we can go in with this highway. Let's start off with the obvious, which is this is another spur off of H1. It connects Pearl Harbor. These freeways all seem to converge right around one area, basically. The 4 interstates kind of converge in this stretch of area around Pearl City, north of Pearl Harbor. And that is not a coincidence, because as we said, Pearl Harbor was central to the American Pacific Fleet operation, and so they wanted all of these freeways to converge in that area for a very good reason. H3 runs northeasterly from Pearl Harbor, that general area, off to the Marine Corps base on the northeast side of the island. Completed in 1997, but boy, it took a long time for us to get there. The long and winding road that led to its construction was probably about, 35 years in the making, Tom. Because it was proposed, and then the environmental movement took hold, and then there were lawsuits, there were counter lawsuits, there were environmental studies, there were counter studies, and then finally the politicians won out and basically forced this thing through in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, this is kind of like the poster child of you kind of hit the 1970s with freeway development kind of hitting just the giant roadblock because you had the National Environmental Policy Act, which required, this is 1970, environmental impact statements be conducted on new corridors. So if anyone's wondering why in modern times, like, so much road development takes forever, is because you need these EISs to even get anything going. And if you've ever read an environmental impact statement, it can be up to 800 pages, sometimes more. So what happened with H3 was, either an environmental impact statement would be conducted, it would get sued in federal court, it would get ordered back to do another one, which would take years and years and years and years, and you get this rinse repeat cycle, which goes on for decades, which finally ended in the 1990s with the freeway actually being built.
Yeah, so I think once the final legal hurdles were cleared in roughly 1986, it took 11 years to build the thing. Roughly yes. At about 1 mile per year. This freeway is about 15 miles in length, and it represented an immense engineering challenge. Forget the environmental challenge for a second, but when you're dealing with the mountain range on the north side of the island, as we mentioned before, it presented its own set of unique engineering challenges that are rarely seen anywhere else in America. I don't know about you guys, but I would say that this is right up there with the top engineering achievements on the interstate highway system. Just the engineering that it took to build this thing, and again, the supply demand, the supply logistics that go along with building a freeway of this magnitude out in remote Polynesia. It had to have been an immense challenge, and they managed to pull it off. I mean, it took over 10 years to build it, but in the end, they built something that is really, really incredible.
Yeah, in fact, it's the only highway on Oahu that was actively promoted when I was like on tours or anything, they would often reference you gotta drive H3, and that's the only road on Oahu that really these kind of little tourism businesses and tour agencies are really pushing, and it's for a good reason.
Yeah, I mean, I've driven a lot of the interstate system. I've seen a lot of great stretches of freeway in this country. I have yet to see anything that mile for mile exceeds H3 in terms of the scenery, the engineering involved with it, and just how spectacular drive it is. It's hard to top. It's really, I would imagine that for most road and travel enthusiasts, it is a bucket list drive. And you will be greatly nourished physically and spiritually if you manage to make it out to Oahu and drive this thing. I'm talking to you there, Doug.
Yep, that is Hawaii. I have not driven H3. I have driven my share of, I would say bucket list interstate stretches, but H3 is not one of them yet.
Yeah. Something else I would like to mention at this point is that the highways that cross the mountain range between Honolulu and the windward side of the island, they are subject to closure in events of inclement weather, such as high winds and heavy rains. The H3 is no exception to this. However, because so much of it is elevated above the mudslide plains, the only thing that really closes that freeway is high winds, which in the winter is, they're no stranger to that in Honolulu and Hawaii because of the Kona systems that come in off the Pacific. So you can get some really mean windstorms in the winter months. And also, for some reason, they've become much more susceptible to hurricanes in recent years. I don't know what that's all about, if that's just a little blip on the radar or what that is. But so you do have a system of variable message signs around the island that indicate the status of the 3 highways that go across the island, and they all have tunnels to go underneath the mountain range. And you have some very interesting variable message signs here. So, for example, I really like this one in the upper right corner of this slide. You see how the default message reads exit only. This is on, I think this is on Kamehameha Highway, if I'm not mistaken. One of these highways on the northeast side of the island. It can be switched to read closed ahead. And there's a yellow flashing light system on the top of this sign that would be utilized in the event that the interstate is closed. I've never actually seen those lights used. I don't know if there are any pictures of those signs illuminated in that way, but that's my understanding of what they would be capable of being switched to read.
The turnaround point for the northbound side is pretty interesting because it's right in front of the tunnel. I noticed there's a big sweeping U-turn point.
Yeah, they do have. Like if you go back to the like this slide here shows it, where the areas at both tunnel portals on the interstate have these large plazas where you can turn traffic around if necessary. So yeah, that's an interesting little touch. And now that the thing that also makes this unique is that this stretch of the interstate that goes underneath the mountain range is part of a stretch of freeway that goes about 10 miles between exits. So if you were to get stuck out here, you wouldn't really have a place to go unless you had a place to turn around somewhere on the system, which is what they appear to have at each of the tunnel portals.
Yeah, because you're committed to it. And once you get over Hawala Valley, there's nothing below it, the freeway. I don't think there's even like any roads except for maybe like some access stuff for maintenance, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, so like on the slide that I have up right now, the picture in the lower right, that is the distance to the next exit, 10 miles. So once you're on it for a while. So, and because they were dealing with such a narrow right of way when they built this thing, there isn't a place to build intermediate interchanges or, you know, implement some sort of U-turn system like you see on most rural interstates. So they, as I said, they kind of implemented that, you know, plaza setup like they have at the tunnel entrances, and that kind of suffices in that role. Now, the interstates H1, H2, and H3 have very reasonable stories behind their designations. You know, they make sense once you hear the explanation for them. H201 is a bit trickier. It's the outlier of the four, and I think we should spend some time talking about how they arrived at this designation, because obviously you look at it on the screen and it's got the H prefix like all the others on Hawaii do, but it's really a 4-digit interstate, really, because there's 4 characters thrown into that shield. It's one of the only examples of that on the American interstate system. This was not built as part of the interstate system. The Honolulu Freeway was built as part of Highway 78, and it was signed as such for the first, 20 years or so of its existence. It was only later that they got the idea to add it to the interstate system. And then quite the debate erupted, you know, at the federal level as far as what to call this auxiliary interstate. Interestingly, H4 was not considered, as far as I know, right, Tom? They didn't
see any evidence of them thinking about using H4 for this corridor.
Okay. Yeah, so H4 was not used, but I think that they realized that the best number for this would have been some sort of auxiliary route number. Now, their original thought was, well, all auxiliary routes are 3 digits. So we already have H1, so in order to create a third digit, we'll just call it H1A. You know, to kind of denote that it's a spur off of H1 or maybe a connector to H1 somehow. It's my understanding that AASHTO said no to that because they didn't want to create an interstate designation with 2 letters in it.
Yeah, it's part of their modernized policy against suffix routes. So even like with the U.S. route system and interstate system, they haven't approved a suffix route in a very, very long time. So when Hawaii 78 became approved to be an interstate by the Federal Highway Administration, they were okay with it being H1A, but it was the AASHTO that said, no, this is not jive with our numbering conventions.
Yeah, and so H1A was the first proposed designation for the Honolulu Freeway, and you look at the hypothetical shield that I have here on the screen, and it looks very clumsy. Having 2 letters in an interstate shield just doesn't look right at all. But they were kind of following the 3-digit interstate rule quite literally with this idea. I think that's why they created H1A, was to try to stick to 3 digits. And then when they realized that wasn't going to work, they said, well, we can create a 4-digit highway, assuming H has to remain in the prefix. And so that's what they did. They then proposed, well, let's just call it H101, again, to denote that it's a spur off of H1. But then again, that got rejected by AASHTO because they came back with H201, citing that this was more of a bypass of H1 rather than a spur off of it. And so that's how they arrived at the H201 number. they also arrived at the H201 number because they said, well, pretend for a second that the H prefix doesn't exist. So, like, assume that this is Interstate 1, for instance. So what would the auxiliary route number be in this case? Well, it would be 201, right? So, in essence, they're acknowledging that the real number of this highway is 1. It's not H1. Again, as I said, the H prefix is more of an administrative thing. So how they arrived at H201 was to say, well, the H doesn't really exist for our purposes of numbering, and we're calling this a bypass of Interstate H1, so we'll just call it H201. And that's how they arrived at the number that they have today. Although I do think that it would have been really interesting had they actually gone ahead with H1A. That certainly would have been unique. It would have been the only interstate in America with multiple letters in its designation.
Instead, we got a 4-digit interstate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, we broke new ground either way, right?
Yeah.
And they actually didn't sign it for a long time until the 2000s. And from what I recall, it was because the 4 digits in the Interstate Shield was something that Hawaii's Department of Transportation couldn't really get their mind around how they wanted to actually go around and sign. So
didn't they have to create a new shield, basically, like a wider version of it?
I believe so, yeah.
And then the feds had to approve it, obviously, because it's interstate signage. So yeah, that's like they couldn't actually sign it. Like they approved the route number, and then they realized very quickly, well, wait a second, how are we actually going to sign this? So they went through quite a number of years of, first of all, not even knowing what the heck they were going to call it. And then once they figured that out, they realized at the last minute, well, gee, we don't even have a standard shield available to use for such a designation. So then that had to go through a federal approval process. But it is signed for the most part. You do see some Hawaii Route 78 shields still on this. But by and large, the interstate shields have taken over. So this, you can see here, some of these are older generation, like from the early 2000s. These ones here, like the one in the lower right of this slide, these look to be much more recent than that. But yeah, so this freeway was kind of the de facto H1 for a number of years because, as I said, the section of H1 that goes past Pearl Harbor and the airport was not completed until the 80s. Well, this section of freeway was in place by the late 60s. So it basically connected the two disjointed sections of H1, leading westward from Pearl City and then leading eastward through Honolulu. It connected those two sections of the freeway together. And that's kind of why today I'm going to go back a few slides and show you this interchange again. This is why if you're going west on H1 out of Honolulu, if I can go back to this slide here and look at the picture in the lower right, you can see how this is laid out, where H1 basically exits off of itself at the split going west out of Honolulu. That's because the H201 freeway, or what became that, was in place much, much earlier and was in place as the de facto through traffic route across the island. So H1 was kind of an afterthought at that point when they built this interchange. So that's kind of why it's this weird substandard thing. It's an unusual thing that happens. You don't often see mainline interstates exiting off of each other like that, but that's kind of what happened here.
Why the Middle Street going over that interchange is still a Hawaii route. I forget what number it was. Yeah, that's why that's still its own state highway, just for like a half mile.
Just like for the bridge or whatever that is.
Yeah, it goes right over H1 and H201.
Yeah. It's one of those goofy 4-digit routes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of them, but that one kind of makes sense from a maintenance perspective, at least.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Yep. All right, we've arrived at the H4 part of the program. You are very correct when you casually observe that, well, H1 is an absolute disaster, and why were there no serious plans to build an additional highway across Honolulu? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because actually there were talks and plans drawn up for basically what would have been an H1 relief route across central Honolulu. This highway, which was known on planning maps in the late 1960s as H4, was proposed to basically run through Waikiki and downtown Honolulu on a more waterfront path. And there were different iterations of the design. There were options to build a fully elevated freeway. There were options to build a tunnel. Either way, it would have been enormously expensive and destructive to central Honolulu and the tourism district around Waikiki. So unsurprisingly, there was a lot of opposition to this proposal, and it died a very unceremonious death in the late 60s. But Hawaii DOT had it right. They knew that H1 was going to be completely overwhelmed through Honolulu like it is today. And they saw H4 as a way to sort of alleviate some of that problem they saw coming down the line. The only real sizable part of H4 that exists today are the ramps that you see in these two pictures here. This is the H1 westbound off-ramp to Kapiolani Boulevard. And you can see the stub here that would have served the H4 main line. That's about it as far as the amount of H4 that ever saw the light of day.
I think part of the Dillingham Boulevard exit incorporated stub would have gone to H4.
Yes, that's true. Like a couple of those ramps in that Dillingham Nimitz complex there, right east of the airport, would have been utilized for it too, I think. But this is the map that shows the study from the late 60s. This was the proposed path that they would have put this highway on. You can see where H1 is. I don't know if you can see the state highway shields there, but you can see kind of where that is in relation to where they wanted to put H4, which is down here. The circles that you see here, I believe, are where they wanted to put interchanges.
Yes. What's interesting, Dan, is if you look at up to Hawaii Route 920, that actually got built as Hawaii Route 92. So they reused the right of way, but for a surface road.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
So then,
yeah,
because 92 just kind of dead ends in Waikiki, and H4 would have followed the Ali Wai Canal back towards H1. So it wouldn't have gone like right through the middle of Waikiki. It would have skirted the edge of it on the canal line.
Okay, yeah, it kind of would have gone around the backside of it, right?
Yeah.
Like down here, down at the bottom right, yeah. Yeah, so it would not have necessarily been right on the waterfront, but further west, it certainly would have. I mean, this area nowadays it has a lot of, luxury hotels and, and all that stuff, but none of that stuff would have been able to be here had they built this highway where they did, or where they wanted to put it.
Then flipping through the proposal, which is in the H4 blog, you guys want to look at it, I'll probably link it here in a second.
Actually, I've linked it already.
Oh, you did? All right. Doug's already ahead of me. It was proposed in two different ways. One was a surface highway, a surface freeway, and one was a double-decker, kind of like the Embarcadero Freeway or Alaskan Way Viaduct.
Yeah, that would have been a monstrous highway.
Yeah.
Pretty wild.
Yeah. But it's really interesting that we think of that proposal nowadays as foolhardy, but in a way it was kind of ingenious because Hawaii DOT, as I said, kind of was able to see what the future was going to bring. And look, they knew that H1 was not going to be sufficient to handle traffic across town. And so this plan, yes, it was absolutely grandiose and probably never stood much of a chance from both a development and tourism aspect and also from an environmental aspect, but it was an idea that they had and they threw it out there to see if it would stick, and of course it didn't. But you can't fault HDOT for not trying. Yeah, the H4 study is really interesting, and I encourage you guys to check that out if you haven't already. There's some really great stuff in there.
One thing I noticed, Stan, and just even in my trip, even the corridor that exists in the form of Hawaii Route 92 on Ala Moana Boulevard is really, really good as an alternate to H1 if there's traffic on H1 to get to Waikiki and back.
Yeah, I did go that way a couple of times, and I found, if I'm thinking of the same road, then I seem to remember that the signals were synced up pretty well.
Yes.
On the Nimitz Ala Moana corridor there, and yeah, it kind of makes sense that that's where they would have the idea of putting a highway. When you think about where the traffic runs today. But obviously, when you look at the study, you realize, well, gee, they actually had the idea of building the highway here before they put the modern boulevard in. So, again, kind of the way that the east end of Nimitz and how Ala Moana Boulevard is laid out is kind of a lasting vestige of the proposal for H4 in a way. Real quick, because I know we kind of went along with the interstate discussion, but we really can't talk about transportation on Oahu without at least talking about the absolute headache that has been the development of the rail transit system on the island here in the last several years. The Honolulu Area Rapid Transit System was developed as a way to basically build a suburban commuter rail network linking the west side of Oahu near Kapolei with central Honolulu. It's a good idea in concept and on paper because the H1 freeway across the south side of the island has been just completely overwhelmed with traffic in the last 25 years. But, and again, this is because of undisciplined suburban sprawl on an island that really can't sustain that kind of sprawl, just because of the amount of traffic it generates and how little space there is anyway to build new highways. So they came up with the idea of the rapid transit line. Again, it seemed like a good idea until they actually started construction of it, and costs have just completely gotten out of control. The first phase of it, which connects Kapolei with the area around Aloha Stadium, is set to go into operation this year, 2022. Additional phases of the system would bring the line through downtown Honolulu and out to Waikiki, but they don't expect those to be operational until the 2030s at the earliest. And we're talking about a system that is already billions of dollars over budget. So what you see here on this slide, and you have to disregard the dates on this because this was before this system got ridiculously over budget and even further behind schedule wise. But the original idea of the system is as follows here. You have kind of a main line and then you have branches off of that line, further east out towards Honolulu. But the section that's in purple and brown right now, that's really the first phase that's opening up to service. this year, and then you have the other stuff that's under construction or is kind of on the wish list and not funded. And seeing how things have gone to this point, I don't see how they're ever going to be funded. But yeah, the train thing. I mean, I support the idea of mass transit, but they completely built this backwards, if you ask me. Having the rail transit, if they're going to build it at all, they should have built it to connect the airport with downtown. That should have been the first phase. Who cares about this line that's out in the middle of suburbia that nobody's going to use anyway? Not going to use it because it doesn't connect to downtown, which is kind of the important part of the puzzle that you need to have in place in order to secure ridership. I mean, it's an interesting engineering project. I actually know a couple of people who are working on it right now. I mentioned those people who moved out to Hawaii, and that's what they're doing. They're building this. But, I mean, is anybody going to really use this, and is this going to really relieve traffic congestion on the freeway? I doubt it. At least, not until it becomes connected to more significant things like the airport or downtown or the tourist districts. And for something that's elevated pretty much for its entire length like this is, you can imagine how the costs associated with this project would very quickly rise to astronomical levels. I mean, we're not talking, California high-speed rail astronomical, but I mean, this, as I said, is billions of dollars over budget, and that's going to prohibit investment in future extensions of the line to make it more useful. So,
yeah, that's the thing that's just kind of similar, though, between the two projects is that they didn't concentrate on the area it would serve the most first and opted to go for the rural and ended up with a bunch of pushback and over-budget stuff that's really affecting the potential future of its development.
Yeah, Laura makes an interesting observation in the chat. Was the suburban section built first because it was the path of least resistance?
Probably because that's out by Barber's Point and it's all new. So that's out by a naval air station that was decommissioned fairly recently. So you do have a lot of free reign to develop out on that land on the western side of Oahu.
Yeah, that there is quite a bit of rural nature to that part of the line. Yeah. And we'll see that as we go through some of the state highways here. But it's an interesting, conundrum, right? Like, you want to build the section that's easier to build, but also there has to be the question of, well, we need to also build the section that's going to get the most ridership and is going to be the most useful from day one. So that's kind of how I would look at it. They probably settled on what they did because it was, easier to get shovels in the ground sooner to build the western section. But again, what does the western section really connect to? Well, not much. So it's kind of like that, Tom's favorite California high-speed rail project. It looks nice, but it doesn't really do anything. And also it costs you, $11 billion or whatever to build. So, it's just kind of sitting there, and it's not going to get a whole lot of use as far as I can tell. But we ain't here to talk about transit, are we? I can tell that Tom is really restraining himself right now. He wants to go off on a rant about California high-speed rail, I can tell. But
I praise it. I'm cool with trains and mass transit and everything. It sounds great on paper, but in practice, the execution has been abysmal in the last 3-4 decades.
Yeah, well, especially in your state's case, yeah. Let's dive into the state highways. Let's deal with the major ones first. And then we'll kind of go from there and wrap up with some honorable mentions. The Poly Highway, this is one of those highways that kind of retraces an old indigenous Polynesian trail up and over the mountain range. In fact, its name, Poly Highway, utilizes the indigenous word for either cliff or precipice. So that's where that name comes from. And if you look at the original highway, this is the highway that exists today is a modern upgrade of it. But the original highway was literally built right along the cliffside, as it descended down to the windward side of the island. The old highway, I believe, is open, depending on, slide conditions and whatnot. It is a hiking trail, at least part of it is. And the Poly Overlook is a great place to stop and look at the cliffside, and you get some really awesome views of the windward side of Oahu from there.
Yeah, the overlook is part of the older highway. If you go down below the viewing platform, there's actually a bridge stamp right there. I think it's in 1931, if I remember right.
Yeah, so the original highway, which we're looking at in this slide here, the picture in the lower left, that is the original highway that retraced the original indigenous trail. And it was very narrow, very windy. It was barely wide enough for two cars in most places. It was subject to, rock slides and mudslides and stuff like that during periods of rain in the winter months. So you had a situation where, the highway was very, very difficult to navigate, and it was very obvious that an upgrade was necessary. And so they built the modern 4-lane highway, complete with the tunnels through the mountain. And that's the highway that we travel today. But at least this piece of the old highway is still quite visible to visitors at the Poly Overlook.
Yeah.
Yeah, then when I was there, they had a big old fence that they put in, but it was very easy to get around. So I don't really know if it was intended to really stop people from hiking the older road. There was no sign saying you couldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, but these are some of the views you get from the Poly Overlook, and as I said, it's really spectacular stuff.
Worth the $15 to pay if you're a non-resident of Hawaii, I would take it.
You had to see the pay station, though. Which I didn't see until we left.
Oops.
Exactly, that's how I looked at it.
Yeah, I don't think it was $15 when I was there.
Yeah.
I do remember paying something.
So.
I don't remember what it was, but yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if that number went up significantly the last couple of years. Like Highway is sort of the companion highway across the mountain range. This one is roughly parallel and a couple of miles west of the Poly Highway. It's another modern 4-lane facility, complete with a pair of tunnels beneath the mountain range. I would say of the two, this is the more anticlimactic of the two as far as the journey. And of course, it doesn't have a scenic overlook associated with it. But it's one of two highways that really gets you directly from Honolulu to the windward side. It's important to remind you at this juncture that H3, while it does cross the mountain range in a similar area, it does not go to Honolulu. It goes to Pearl Harbor, as you can see in the signage in the lower right of this slide. So it's very important that you realize that while H3 is very useful for getting across the island, it does not directly take you to Honolulu like the Like and Poly highways do.
So I've talked to some people that were in the military before H3 was finished, and this was the de facto route across the island before you had H3. And I'm to understand this got pretty hectic at times with the amount of traffic it would get. Like it would be backed up for miles sometimes. Because there was a disconnected part of H3 that was built earlier on near the Marine Corps base, and 63 does line up with it.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's like where that disjointed section ended is where the interchange is with 63.
Correct.
Yeah, so then the two kind of fed directly into each other, and so yeah, that's how that would have happened. Yep. Yeah, I can't imagine, back in the 80s, for instance, all the military equipment having to use, the mountain pass highways there. I mean, I'm sure it was an absolute mess.
Yeah.
Around the east and southeast corners of Oahu, we have the Kalanianaole Highway. And I'm sure I'm going to butcher some of these pronunciations at some point during the course of the evening. I hope I haven't done that one too bad. But this is sort of a backward C shape. It's designated as Highway 72, although no one calls it that. It crosses, again, this very southeastern corner of the island. On this slide here, you can see how it starts off in far eastern Honolulu and then kind of curves northerly and then back westerly towards the southeastern windward side of Oahu. Very scenic highway. It's one of those that's kind of off the beaten path because most people who, when they visit the island, they take one of the 3 cross-island tunnel routes to reach the windward side of the island. They usually don't go out of their way to take Highway 72 around, but it's a very pretty highway. A lot of it is right up against the cliff sides on the Pacific coast. It's a very enjoyable scenic drive if you have the time to spare.
And if you're in the movies, this was heavily featured in 51st Dates, Hawaii 72. There's a lot of background drops that you can see that line up with that movie. That's how I got my wife to get really enthused to put on this one.
You had to bribe her a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah, well. Yeah, apparently you can see some of the other islands further east, like Molokai and Lanai on a clear day. I guess it wasn't clear enough on the day that I went out this way, but I guess they're close enough, right? I mean, it's not, they're not that far away.
Yeah, I could see it a little bit, and I know Scott did see it for sure.
Yeah.
Pretty cool, he said, when he was recapping his trip out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see Molokai is not that far. So
next time I'm in Hawaii, I'm gonna hit some of those other islands because I think I got this one covered pretty well. Kamehameha Highway. This is the single longest highway by name. Single longest continuous highway that has the same name attached to it. It's got 4 different state highways that have been associated with it over the years. It's named for Kamehameha the First, or Kamehameha the Great, as he is known sometimes. Hawaiian king in the 1800s, I believe. If you are a movie buff, you will probably recognize the Kualoa Ranch, which was the site of the filming of a lot of famous movie scenes over the years. This is on the north side of Oahu. I believe Jurassic Park has some ties to this area as well.
The original movie it was filmed at Kualoa Ranch.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. When I watch that movie nowadays, I say to myself, gee, it looks an awful lot like Hawaii. But when I first saw the movie, I thought it was all like some sort of set or CGI or whatever. But now that I know what it is, it is pretty cool.
Yeah, and then what's kind of neat about that segment is it was actually a auxiliary airstrip too, the highway, Kamehameha Highway during World War II.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Their website touts itself as the Jurassic Ranch or something like that, or no, Jurassic Valley. That's Kahlua.com.
Well, I think I think that's the most famous movie that was filmed there, but there have been others too, right?
There's a lot, dozens. There's just a ton of them. They got to play there. We actually stopped in and checked it out. It was worth going to see.
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't do. But then again, I'm not really much of a movie buff myself, so you weren't going to get me to stop and look at movie sets for a few hours. But if you are into movies and you're into that kind of thing, then it's definitely something that you should check out. I like this steel truss bridge on this section of the highway in central Oahu and this slide here. Again, we don't really, like the people of Oahu don't really talk in terms of the state highway number, but this is on the Highway 80 section of the highway in central Oahu. It's one of the only steel bridges of this type in the state, I believe. There aren't that many bridges that look like this in Hawaii.
A lot of them got replaced during the post-1955 era when all that federal aid money was going into replacing them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of bridges to them, though.
Mm-hmm. This is another one of those very scenic drives, especially as you wrap around the north side of the island. Keep in mind, though, that the road does wind quite a bit, and the speed limit is pretty low. I think it's about 35 miles an hour for its entire length. So it is a pretty slow journey overall, but in some cases, like you see here in this picture, you're right up against the coastline. So it does offer quite a lot of interesting scenic views, which make it very memorable. Yeah, and then this section of the highway. This was formerly a part of the state highway system. It might. I don't know if it still is or not. That's the problem with Hawaii, is that you never really know what's what sometimes. But this section of the old highway was at one time designated as State Highway 830. And God knows what it is today. But this is another kind of off the beaten path stretch of highway that's quite enjoyable.
Yeah, that's the original routing of 83 before the modern highway was built to the west. My understanding of it is the 830 designation is actually Honolulu County, which has an exact replica shield of the Hawaii spade. So when you're looking at Honolulu County route, there's really, without any looking into it, you wouldn't know the difference at all.
Nimitz Highway, named for American Admiral Chester Nimitz. This was built originally during the World War II years as a public works project to provide additional connectivity between Pearl Harbor and central Honolulu. In the days before the interstate system and a more proper federal funding system was in place for improving the roads of Hawaii, there were separate federal projects supported by the armed forces during the years of World War II and immediately after to improve the quality of the roads in and around the bases, and to connect those with the civilian airfields and also the central business districts of Honolulu and other communities. And the Nimitz Highway was one of the sort of the highways that led the way in terms of that improvement of the island's infrastructure. Nowadays, we see it as a major commuter thoroughfare, and it's also sort of a local traffic alternate to the H1 freeway, which you can see is built on this viaduct in the picture in the lower right here. This, as I alluded to before, this was the last section of the H1 to be built in the mid-1980s. But it was built basically cantilevered above the original Nimitz Highway in the area around Honolulu Airport. Nowadays, it's part of
What's
Hawaii.
interesting?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what's interesting, if you look at older photos of Nimitz Highway, you could see that it was built alongside Kamehameha Highway, and they ran alongside each other as completely separate grades. And when Interstate H1 was built on top of those structures, it all became just Nimitz Highway, what was beneath H1. So that's why Kamehameha Highway doesn't exist. It's gapped under H1, and there's a small segment of it in Honolulu that doesn't connect to any other part of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because Nimitz Highway is two separate carriageways nowadays,
Yeah.
but back then, those were the two different highways, right? Like you had, like each carriageway was two directions of traffic, whereas nowadays it's, they completely redid that whole stretch when the interstate came through.
And I'm posting a photo or a location where it can be found on the blog site of a photo that shows it. It's pretty neat to see.
The Farrington Highway is a personal favorite of mine. This is the one that runs up the west shore of Oahu. And one of the things that makes it unique is that this highway runs through the part of the island that is still home to most of the island's indigenous population. And because of its relative isolation, this highway doesn't really connect to anything beyond Waianae. So the upper end of the highway, that's designated as Hawaii 93, it exists in a very isolated part of the island, and so there are certain cultural aspects of the villages in this area, and of course the driving experience itself that separate it and make it very unique compared to anything else that you would see on the island. I know that this is one that you didn't really get to experience, Tom, but one of my favorite views in the entire island is, I'm going to skip ahead a few slides here. I would say that this view in this slide is probably, next to the view of the Pacific coast as you come out of the tunnel on eastbound H3. This would be my favorite view on the entire island. This one that you're looking at here, which is at the northern end of Highway 93. Again, this is a very secluded, very isolated part of Oahu. And you're not really that far from the suburbia of Kapolei and Waianae at this point. You're only a few miles away from that, but you do feel like you're a world away out this way.
Or on the Oregon coast.
Yeah, I mean,
it does have that vibe to me.
Tom, you look at all these mountains and these hills, it looks a lot like Illinois, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just the majestic splendor. I mean, but it's not Illinois. It's important that we remember that. Nothing can compete.
Yeah.
We should just all drop that. Illinois is where it's at.
Yeah, right.
It does have the world's most beautiful drive.
Yeah. I mean,
From Peoria.
Yeah, what is that, I-70?
I think it's Illinois 29. It's along the river there.
Oh, okay.
But other thing about the Farrington, for our Disney fan friends, there's a like their Disney's Hawaiian Resort Alani is located right off of the Farrington.
Yeah, so some people in our audience who are into Disney movies, I'm not going to name names here, but perhaps that would pique your interest a little bit.
Yeah.
So, earlier in the chat, Dan, Scott pointed out when he went up Hawaii Route 93, access to Kanea Point is now blocked by a Space Force satellite tracking facility. So you have to go all the way up to the disconnected part on Honolulu County Route 930 to get to it now.
Yeah, that's interesting because in 2019 when I was out there, it was open to hiking and off-road vehicles. This slide. I have a couple pictures of the 930 section. You can see that, I mean, it is gated there, but, I mean, obviously they do allow off-road vehicles to go through, at least they used to. I think it's about an 8-mile hike round trip, or it used to be when it was open. So it was something that you could easily do in a day. But I guess not anymore, right?
Well, from Kanea from 930 you can get to Kanea Point, but apparently you can on 93. And even looking at Google Maps now, it does say there's a Space Force installation right there. So I guess you only got 930 to get to Kanea Point State Park now.
Okay, so maybe the 930 section is still operational, but not the 93
Yeah, that's what
section.
Scott said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that whole stretch there, as you may recall, was part of a continuous Farrington Highway that wrapped around that section of the island, but a lot of that was lost due to mudslides and reclaimed by nature over the years, and it just became too expensive to maintain, and there were too few cars or traffic in general to justify keeping it, so it gradually faded from the state highway system.
Yeah, and actually railroad grade too around Kanea Point. It was part of the Oahu Railway, so it wasn't really ever intended for traffic for like modern vehicles. It would have needed to be widened, and I don't believe it was ever surfaced. I think it was actually spun out of the state highway system, if I remember right, in 1968, around Kanea Point.
Okay. Yeah, that timeline sounds about right. Yeah. I want to spend a minute or two talking about Pearl Harbor because I know that that's something that came up in the chat at least a couple of times. I've been glancing at it, and also I know that you and I both, Tom, experienced the sites at Pearl Harbor. So I wanted to give our viewers a little bit of a summary of the some of the landmarks and some of the things that you can do if you do visit the historic sites here. These pictures of mine are from my visit in 2019. There's a lot to do here. I mean, you could spend an entire day here and probably not get to everything. There's a visitor center and a museum that's central to everything. The battleship USS Missouri is anchored off in the harbor. That ship is very significant in American history because it's the ship where the American and Japanese delegations signed the Articles of Unconditional Surrender in Tokyo Bay in 1945, ending hostilities in the Pacific Theater. Here you have the statue of Chester Nimitz in this photo here. The battleship Missouri is also one of the significant members of the Iowa class of battleships. They are the largest capital ships ever built by the U.S. Navy. The Iowa class is interesting because they had originally envisioned 6 of these ships, although they only ever built 4 of them. There were 2 others that were started but never finished, and there was another class of battleships called the Montanas that would have been even larger than this, but they never even built one of those. Because right on the time that the Iowas were being built, naval strategists realized that the future of naval warfare involved aircraft carriers and airplanes, and capital ships were seen as nowhere near as efficient to conduct long-range warfare. So they moved gradually away from battleships during World War II and invested more in aircraft carriers. And obviously that was a very smart decision considering how things played out in the Pacific Theater. We also have, of course, the memorials and monuments to the men lost in the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. Memorials like this, commemorating the USS Oklahoma's lost sailors. Of course, the most famous of the ships that were lost at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 was the USS Arizona. One of the ship's anchors is on display here at the main museum. Also, one of the ship's bells is on display. You can see that, and you can see both of those in this slide here. Of course, the Arizona Memorial is one of the it's one of the most coveted memorials on United States soil. Definitely a must-see attraction. Tom, I think you got to see this?
I did go to the Arizona, yes.
Okay. What did you think of it?
I mean, you didn't really get a good scale for how big that ship really was and how many people probably were on it or were on it when it was attacked, but it's just overwhelming how much destruction is like literally sitting right underneath you in the water. That just had to have been something that I don't think in a modern sense really, especially in the United States, that we really got a good grasp on what it was probably like to be part of a war of that size. Because that's just destruction we just don't really see all that often, even in modern times.
No, I mean, as I see it, there are really three sites that kind of give you that idea. There's the Arizona, there's Gettysburg, and there's Ground Zero in Manhattan.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk about the last 150 years or so, that's really all the experience that we have, at least of this kind of thing happening on American soil. And it is one of America's hallowed grounds, obviously, and it's a very sobering sight. But I would say that the Arizona Memorial itself is very tastefully done, and I really like the way that all of this is laid out and set up. I mean, the memorial obviously spans the wreck of the ship. And then, if I can go back a couple of slides, I didn't really put this in the slideshow. I probably should have put this in somewhere to sort of illustrate it. But to bring us back to the Missouri really quick, as we said, the Missouri is the ship where World War II ended. And the Arizona is basically where World War II, at least America's involvement in it, began. And they very intentionally put these two ships, the Arizona and the Missouri, basically they oriented them so that they face each other across the harbor. They are basically moored. Well, I mean, the Arizona is the wreck, obviously, but the Missouri is moored in alignment with the Arizona wreck, and the two face each other. Sort of a subliminal message to remind us that the beginning and the end of World War II are right in that same place, basically. Very interesting how they did all the Pearl Harbor sites and all that. It really was a highlight for me. I'm a road geek. I like roads, and I like to take pictures of roads, and I like to drive roads, and I like to talk about roads. But visiting Pearl Harbor was probably my single favorite part of the whole trip. And I think that any American who has an interest in our country's history and has the means to be able to fly, in my case it was 6,000 miles roughly, but if you have the means to get out here and see it, it is more than worth the trip. You will not be disappointed. It is just an incredible place. Well, we haven't really talked about bridges in this slideshow, but here's one that we should mention. I think, Tom, you wrote a blog article on the Ford Island Bridge, if I'm not mistaken. It was one of the first ones that we did, as far as the Hawaii series is concerned.
Yes, I have an affinity for float bridges, it seems.
Yeah. So this is a partial floating bridge over the quay at Pearl Harbor. It is not. It's interesting in that it is not really open to the public. The only way that you can cross it is if you have a U.S. naval pass of some sort in a private car, or you can also cross the bridge on the shuttle bus that takes you from the main museum at Pearl Harbor over to the Missouri battleship, which is how I was able to cross the bridge and get the picture on the right. It's an interesting bridge. The movable part of it, well, there's a movable part that it's not really a bascule bridge. It's kind of like got a gate in it.
It's got pontoons.
Yeah, like it's kind of got like a gate that swivels in and out. That's how the navigation span opens, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
It reminded me a lot of the Port Gamble Bridge up in Washington State on Washington State 104 because it serves a very similar purpose. I didn't get to see it in action, but they're very impressive, these spans, when they're working, when they're letting a ship or a submarine by.
And I know that, like, for floating or pontoon bridges, there's only a few examples in the United States. This is the only one in Hawaii that I'm aware of. And of course, there's the Washington State, over the Hood Canal, and also Lake Washington, in Seattle, and also the Brookfield floating bridge in Vermont. So this is kind of a very unique bridge, in the U.S.
Right. Yeah. It's got an interesting design and an interesting appearance to it, right? I mean, because as we said, part of it is fixed and part of it is floating, so it's kind of a hybrid bridge. But yeah, very cool.
And it's this was the first span to Ford Island too. Before 1998, you had to take a boat to get there. And it's always been for a very, very long time, it's been part of the U.S. Navy's infrastructure, like housing and installation, operations, and all that. But it seems to me, having been a DoD worker for a very long time, that seems incredibly inconvenient to have to take a ferry to work like that.
Yeah, I mean, seeing the amount of traffic that uses it, from my trip out there, I can't imagine that they actually did that, where ferries was the only way across up until relatively recently. But yeah, that's how it worked. Let's do some state highway honorable mentions before we start to wrap this up. We've talked about the interstates, we've talked about the major state highways, we've talked about Pearl Harbor and the exhibits there. So let's start to wrap this up by hopefully in a somewhat rapid fire fashion. Let's hit some of the state highway honorable mentions that I think we should talk about. What do you say there, Tom? Let's one of the ones that's kind of off the radar, yet one of my favorites to drive was the Sand Island Access Road, which is also known on maps as the Sand Island Parkway. It's officially State Highway 64. You won't see State Highway 64 shields on it, however. I think there's one Highway 64 shield in existence, and it's on Nimitz Highway at the intersection with Sand Island Parkway. It consisted of a double leaf bascule bridge, which you can see in the pictures here, although the bridge has not been opened in many years. It used to be a movable bridge, but it's now locked in the fixed position as far as I'm aware.
Sealed with concrete. It's fully sealed.
Okay, yeah. I think it was known on maps as the Honolulu Harbor Bridge, if I'm not mistaken. That is ringing a bell for some reason.
I believe that's correct.
Okay, yeah. But
Lieutenant John R. Slattery Bridge.
Okay, yeah.
And now it's Honolulu Harbor Bridge.
Okay. Tom, I know you had a real affinity for Hawaii Route 65 when you were browsing and researching the history of the state highway system, because this was a classic example of not really being sure about what exactly this highway's designation even was.
It's actually designations. It's not just 65. It's 630.
Yeah, so there. Do you want to kind of summarize the 65 versus 630 shenanigans here?
So what's going on here? What you're seeing at the 630 is basically this obscure reference to the fact that a lot of what is now Hawaii Route 65/630 was once Hawaii Route 63 before the first segment of Interstate H3 was completed around Marine Corps Base, Hawaii. So it's not a one-for-one completely with the older route of Hawaii Route 63, but it does incorporate a lot of the former mileage of it. So what you see from Interstate H3 is you see a reference on one sign to Hawaii Route 630 and another to Hawaii Route 65, but on route, you don't see anything. And heading up Hawaii Route 83 and Hawaii Route 63, you do not see a reference to either Hawaii Route 65 or 630.
No, of course not. Why would you ever expect that? I mean, that is a classic Hawaii DOT oops.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is hardly the only example of that, but this is the one that we kept coming back to time and again as we were researching the history of the island, because it just makes you want to pull your hair out, you know.
And what gets me is that looking at some of the more recent USGS maps, that's actually the information the Hawaii Department of Transportation is giving the USGS, is that those two routes coexist on the exact same routing.
Yeah, that is very strange. And neither of them are particularly signed very well, so it just adds to the confusion and the chaos. But you know, we're trying to figure it out. We swear. You know, some DOTs don't make it easy for us, but you know, we're working on it.
Unfortunately, things like canal paddles, you could find it, the obscure stuff, very easily.
Yeah. Here's another one that's maybe a little more straightforward, but not much. It's what used to be Hawaii Route 66. I don't think Hawaii Route 66 has existed for many years, but there is still a 66 shield on Nimitz Highway, right at the intersection here with what's now Hawaii Route 7310, which was born from the original alignment of 66, which ran from the Tripler Hospital down to Honolulu Airport. One of the few prominent examples of a well-signed 4-digit Hawaii route, as you can see. But the history of Hawaii 66 is somewhat interesting and worth a footnote, at least.
Yeah, It's odd. I just don't know why they wouldn't just keep it Hawaii Route 66. Like it was a little tiny Navy facility that was like south of the airport where Hawaii Route 66 extended below Nimitz Highway, but really there's not a lot of reason to have changed that designation to 7310. I'm really trying to. Even writing this, I could not figure this out, why it would need to be changed at all, or if it went all the way up to Tripler Hospital or not.
Yeah, I was always under the impression that 66 ended at Tripler Hospital, but as you kind of read into it more and more, that answer becomes more and more ambiguous, actually. So, but again, this is sort of a common theme, right? As you look back at the historical documents for the Hawaii State Highway System, you find that a lot of the answers are ambiguous for a lot of these state highways. That I don't know if it was just a lack of good record keeping, or if it was just that the records were kept well and that these things just weren't valued that much. I don't know. What do you think, Tom? I mean, it seems to me like there just wasn't a whole lot of good documentation in a lot of instances.
It seems like in 1968, the Hawaii Department of Transportation really tried to simplify their state highway system, which in my opinion did not need to be simplified. They did spin off mileage of roads that really probably were not worthy of being state highway quality. And you see that certainly on Oahu with some of the, like reshuffling of Farrington Highway and some of the other roads that are on the island. But really, the renumbering part of it doesn't make sense, but what they seem to be kind of going with is if they would retain the 2-digit numbers for roads that they considered to be kind of like critical mainline highways, and would reassign everything else is either a 3-digit or 4-digit highway. And the 4-digit highways seem to kind of come a little bit after that era, but kind of seem to have that same purpose. So really there adds some more ambiguity into it. It's like, so when did Hawaii Route 66 disappear? Because it's still kind of scientific field still.
Yeah, and as Scott mentions in the chat, there still is that 66 shield. Yeah. So something that I should clear up here. So you have 7310, which is well signed. You also have the matter of 7345. So 7310, as far as I can tell, runs between Nimitz Highway and H201. And then from H201 to the gates of Tripler Hospital is an unsigned 7345. Now, this is another one of those weird instances where they just completely give it a different state highway designation for no discernible reason that I can tell. And again, both of these 4-digit routes are spin-offs of the original Hawaii 66, at least as far as I can tell. So there's just so much, nonsense that you come across with these designations that they don't really make a whole lot of sense in a lot of instances. But they tried to simplify things, and I guess in some ways they succeeded, but in some instances they just made things more irritating. Especially for people like us who are trying to piece the puzzle back together.
Yeah, it's I think they failed in their attempt to simplify, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's a failure.
Now, moving on, we have more conventional highways that we could talk about, like 76, known as Fort Weaver Road. This features the only the only interchange on the island with an exit number that is not part of the interstate system. I think I said that in a way that makes sense. It features the only numbered interchange that's not part of a freeway on the island. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Can I, Doug? Do you want to serve as the quality control department here?
The only non-interstate numbered interchange.
All right, that sounds a little bit better. Yeah. See, this is why we have Doug on the show tonight. You know, he's the moderator. He's also serving as the quality control / quality assurance department. He's also posting links in the chat. I mean, he's doing it all tonight.
And I'm chiming in occasionally as well.
Yeah, that too. We like to know that you're still with us and that you haven't burned the cabin down.
No, it's still
It's here, huh?
Still there, yeah.
Yeah. So that's
It's
Fort
not
Weaver.
like the Battle Creek Sanitarium.
Well, you know. So that was 76. 750 is another weird situation.
Which is still signed to 76 apparently.
Yeah. So I believe in the H.dot log it's listed as 750, but you still find 76 shields in the field. So it's like, well, which is it? You know? And this is another one of these frustrating things when you're trying to piece the history of these designations together. What you'll read about in articles and on official sites will completely be contradicted by what you see in the field. So it just makes the process all that more difficult. 750, I guess it began life as... Well, 750 implies that it was once 75, right?
Yeah, I'm looking at maps that year, like from 1959. I see it as 75. So it's kind of that whole, like if they slap a zero on it, it's a lesser route thing.
Mm-hmm.
But from the very north end, as I think it's as H2 or it's on 99. I don't remember where Scott saw it. There's a 76 shield.
Yeah, on Kamehameha Highway. Yeah. Yeah, right at the intersection with 99. So yeah, like at one point they thought that this was 76. You know, or they just completely whiffed from the start. But yeah. And the two roads do transition into each other seamlessly at H1. That's really the dividing line between the two designations. But, yeah, it's just that infuriating contradiction of what you see on the road versus what you see, or what you expect to see based on the documentation that you're given. And then you have completely unsigned state highways, like 95, which is down in West Kapolei and down by Barber's Point, which serves a very heavily industrialized area of the island. So it's certainly deserving of a state highway designation, but again, you won't see any 95 shields in the wild. There were a few different iterations of Hawaii 95 over the last 60 years or so. I think one of them involved...
It was in downtown, I think, downtown Honolulu.
Yeah, it wasn't directly related to H4, was it?
Yeah, it was actually. It was supposed to be a connector between H1 and H4, following the general corridor of South Street.
Okay, yeah. So that was one iteration of 95, and I think there were a couple of others before they settled on this one that, again, is completely unsigned. It's not the only state highway on the island to be of a significant prominence, yet without any sort of reassurance markers on it.
That's where we went to our luau, was down there too. So very, very heavy industrial down there. And it kind of like ends in a weird way that you wouldn't expect unless you had reassurance shields. It's like you got to figure it out for yourself, which is kind of stupid, but
yeah. Well, that's what I tried to do, because I knew basically the different roads that it was a part of. But yeah, when you make those turns and it just kind of ends the way that it does, it makes no sense whatsoever. But as far as I'm aware, I did clinch Hawaii 95, making all those turns. But it's one of those goofy little state highways. There is a lighthouse down there too, isn't there? At Barber's Point.
Yeah, Barber's Point. That's where I go out. Actually, I got a picture of.
I didn't actually stop to see the lighthouse, but I guess that's something that people do, right?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact history to it, but I know it's a very significant navigation point. A lot of ships running aground out there before they put a lighthouse.
Yeah, that is one of the deep water ports on the island. So you've always had a lot of industrial, commercial shipping coming in there. So that does make sense. Vineyard Boulevard is a surface arterial across the north side of central Honolulu. And this one you might not expect to be well signed, but it is. You have plenty of Hawaii 98 shields along this relatively short state highway.
Yeah, there's a ton of them. Like, what is it, like 5 in each direction at least, something like that?
At least, and they're on both sides of the highway, as you see, or both sides of each roadway. Yeah, they can't wait to tell you that it's Highway 98, but they can certainly wait to tell you a lot of other things elsewhere. The Whitmore Village is connected to Kamehameha Highway via Whitmore Avenue, which is designated as 7012. There is one 7012 shield on Highway, what is that? Highway 80, I guess? The Highway 80 section of Kamehameha. But there are no reassurance shields along the actual avenue. So that, is this actually a state highway? Is it a county route? There's some documentation that suggests that this is actually a Honolulu County route and not a state highway. Again, you're pulling your hair out if you think about this too much, but I considered this to be a state highway when I was out there, and so I drove the length of it just in case it actually was a state highway. So there's that. Kualakai Parkway is a very well-signed 4-digit route. It's the highest numbered route in the state of Hawaii, 8930. This one is significant because of the view you get of the Honolulu Transit Corridor, the elevated structure that actually begins out this way near Kapolei. This is where it starts off its journey in the easterly direction towards Honolulu.
And it's also one of the newest Hawaii routes, having been opened in 2010.
Yeah, it looks pretty new. I mean, when I was out there and I took these pictures, it looked pretty new. So yeah, that makes sense. And they built this, as I understand it, because they're expecting additional suburban sprawl out this way.
This is on lands that were part of Naval Air Station Barbers Point, which was decommissioned in the 1990s.
Okay. Well, folks, that's our PowerPoint for you. I'd like to thank Tom for all his work putting the blog posts together. I mean, it's a really great series that we've put together for Gribblenation.org. Again, the Oahu Highways page is available for your viewing pleasure and consumption in the years ahead, and I hope you guys check it out if you haven't.
And I'll post the link to that again.
Yes, please do, because we want our fans and our followers to have all the links to the good stuff, not just a few of them. So we'll open it up for questions, comments, anything that you guys want to discuss. Tom, Doug, any other things that you want to bring up or discuss or bat around? This is a good time to do that also.
I just really want to do Maui and the Big Island at some point near future. I'm a big national parks person, so the two that I need to go to are in those islands, but it would be pretty cool to clinch those two and do something similar to what we did with Oahu with that. Not quite video capable like Dan is, but right, it's something.
Well, I can be coerced into doing another trip out there to do the other islands.
Yeah. At some point, I have to make it a Hawaii, period. I think my goal is to get to all 50 states by age 50. I have 8.5 years to do that.
Well, you have 8.5 years to do how many states? What, 2?
Alaska and Hawaii, and I plan to go to Alaska in July.
There you go. All right.
So I got 8.5 years to go to Hawaii.
Well, you're right on schedule.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I would love to go back. If I went back to Hawaii, I would go to visit the remaining islands. And some of those islands are small enough that you can cover them in a day. If you were just there to do the state highway system, but yeah, that's kind of what I would like to do. Like take a couple of weeks and just island hop, you know.
And I feel that like if you're going to Hawaii, Oahu's a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
It's kind of like gives you like like the main parts of Hawaii, and of course plenty of hiking, which is something I enjoy doing. And then then from there you get to pick basically what islands you might want to go next, like Maui or the Big Island or what have you.
Yeah, that's the same advice that I would give people. If you've never been to Hawaii and you're looking for a place to start, I would definitely encourage Oahu, for a variety of reasons. One is that it's the most accessible. I find it's also the most like the mainland, culturally. So you feel more, quote unquote, at home, I guess, if you go to Oahu. And then if you only have a few days and you want to check out one of the islands, that's the one that I would pick. And then for more seasoned people who are going back for their second time or more, you can branch out to the other islands, and that's kind of the progression that I would recommend that people follow. But yeah, I think that Oahu is a great place to visit by itself. It's got a lot to offer. There are a lot of interesting road-related sites, as we've discussed here over the last couple hours, and hopefully we've given some of our viewers some ideas as far as places that they can visit if they can ever make it out to Hawaii themselves. Well, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and Doug, Tom, thank you very much for joining me on the panel tonight. It was great having you guys along. Thank you again to Tom for helping out with the blog and getting the Oahu Highways page up on Gribblenation.org. Thank you, Doug, for your help. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, so it was good doing this. We should do more of these Gribblenation shows in the future. I'm sure we can come up with a whole list of nonsensical topics to discuss.
Yeah, certainly. And since this is Hawaii, I'd like to sign off by saying aloha, everyone.
Yes, aloha.
Yes, aloha. Thank you all very much for watching. Be sure to check out our work on the blog and on the podcast and on our other platforms. You can also check out the Roadway Wiz Hawaii Highways playlist to get all your fix on the video footage collected, and all of that stuff should fill your appetite for all things Hawaii. So hope you guys check that out. Thank you all again very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers and aloha.